Okay, this video is going to be about grammar. So we're going to start with commas. So the rules for commas, there's quite a few of them. To separate independent clauses, complete sentences that are connected by fanboys. So you use commas to separate independent clauses. Independent clauses are basically just complete sentences. We have heard that phrase before, what a complete sentence is, and we went over it in the sentence section. A complete sentence or a complete thought, it's basically just it has to have a subject and a verb. It can't be just a modifier by itself. And then the fanboys are the for, and, nor, but, or, yet, so. So you use commas to separate independent clauses that are connected by fanboys. If it's two independent clauses that are not connected by fanboys, then you use a period. You do not use a comma. So for example, I ran to the store and I bought a jar of Nutella. We have that and, so we separated with a comma. I love Game of Thrones, so I started rewatching the whole series. We have the fanboys right there, so we separate it with a comma. I can cook and bake. This one, even though there's an and right there, is it a complete sentence? We have this complete sentence right here, I can cook. Is bake a complete sentence? No, it's not. It's just a single word by itself. So therefore, even though there's an and right here, you do not use a comma. Here you can see I love Game of Thrones, complete sentence. I started rewatching the whole series, complete sentence. Therefore, we use a comma. I want a corgi dog, and I want to call it Pancake. We have an and, we have a comma. It's a complete sentence, right? So I want a corgi dog. Another complete thought, I want to call it Pancake. So since it's two complete sentences and we have an and, we separate it with a comma. Hopefully that makes sense. Use a comma to separate elements that introduce and modify a sentence. So elements that introduce or modify a sentence are called introductory clauses. So they're basically modifiers, but they are in the beginning of the sentence, like they're introducing the actual sentence, but they are modifiers. Introductory clauses are modifiers, okay? For example, yesterday I decided I was in love with Jon Snow. The actual sentence is I decided I was in love with Jon Snow. But we're adding more detail. We're modifying the sentence. When did I decide this? I decided that yesterday. Since I put that first, since I introduced the sentence with that modifier, we put a comma after it. I could have said I decided I was in love with Jon Snow yesterday. If I had said that, I would not need a comma because it's after the sentence. But since it's before, since it's introducing the sentence, we put a comma there. Before starting the recipe, I have to have all the ingredients ready. I have to have all the ingredients ready is a complete sentence by itself. Before starting the recipe, it's a modifier. You cannot say that by itself. It would not make sense. I have to have all the ingredients ready. That's enough. That's enough, right? That's a sentence. You understand what I'm saying. But we're adding extra detail to it, right? But that extra detail, that modifier, is coming before the sentence, before the actual sentence. So because of that, it's an introductory clause, and because of that, we put a comma after it. Ready to explore, I put on my backpack and started up the trail. I put on my backpack and started up the trail is a sentence by itself. That's the actual sentence. Ready to explore is not a sentence by itself, right? So since I put on my backpack and started up the trail is the actual sentence, we see that this modifier right here is coming before the actual sentence. So therefore, it's an introductory clause, and therefore we put a comma after it. Another way that you could write this, you could perfectly fine say I put on a backpack. I should say here, I put on my backpack. But hey, oops. I put on my backpack and started up the trail since I was ready to explore. This sentence is perfectly fine. Like, it's perfectly fine. It says the same thing as this one, but the modifier, since I was ready to explore, the modifier is coming after the sentence. It's coming after the sentence, right? So because of that, there's no comma. But here, it's coming before the sentence, so we put a comma after it because it's introducing. So hopefully you understood what introductory clauses are. Use commas to set off non-essential or parenthetical phrases and clauses. So what is a non-essential clause? So non-essential clause or a parenthetical clause and expression, it's a clauses that if omitted do not change the meaning of the sentence. They're phrases that are inserted into the writer's train of thought. So we don't think in complete, usually our mind, like we don't think in complete sentences, we don't think in essay form, right? We just think. So we usually think very fragmented. So that's basically what this is, right? So it's inserted into the writer's train of thought. It's kind of like a fragment. It's weird. You can hear the pause when starting a parenthetical clause. You can hear the pause because again, it's just random. It's just kind of inserted in there, right? It doesn't flow perfectly because it's just kind of there. It's just like a fragment. It's just inserted into the writer's train of thought. So we're gonna go over some examples. Katie celebrated her birthday, which was in June, with a party and a chocolate cake. You can hear that pause with which was in June. You can hear that pause when you read it. You have to stop a little to continue to read that part, right? So that shows you that it's a parenthetical clause. A lot of things kind of tell you to, like which. Usually if you have which in the middle of a sentence like that, probably going to be one of those. Who, stuff like that. Like there's some identifiers, but I don't think you need to know those. I think it's obvious and I think it's easier to see. So you can perfectly say Katie celebrated her birthday with a party and a chocolate cake. That's fine. It's just that we're adding some extra detail. It's a modifier, but it's just a special type of modifier, right? It's a parenthetical clause, and it's called parenthetical because you could put in parentheses because it's not necessary. You could take this out and it'll be fine. My mother, who is a cook, made a delicious dinner for my birthday. See, you need to stop a little because my mother made a delicious dinner for my birthday is the real sentence. We're just inserting in the middle of the actual sentence a random thing that doesn't really need to be there. So who is a cook? So because of that, because it's in the middle of the sentence, you put commas between it. You don't just put one comma. You don't just put one comma here or just one comma here. Since it's in the middle, you have to put both commas in between. So it's going to be hugged by commas, okay, like a sandwich. My hobby, collecting stamps, has become more of an obsession this summer. My hobby has become more of an obsession this summer is the actual sentence. This is just kind of inserted in there, right? It's just kind of inserted in there. It doesn't really need to be there. Because of that, we put commas in between it. It's a parenthetical clause. Stephanie's decision, in my opinion, was not in her best interest. We don't need this part really. The sentence itself is Stephanie's decision was not in her best interest. That's fine, right? But we have to kind of stop to say this. And because of that, it's a parenthetical clause. So you put commas in between it, right? Commas between. The new park, of course, is a popular tourist destination. And by the way, these are some things that a lot of people do. Like in my opinion, or of course, are almost always going to be parenthetical clauses, if not always. Because they're just there. They're just they are thrown in there. Like you don't need to put that, but they're kind of thrown in there. So the new park, of course, is a popular tourist destination. The new park is a popular tourist destination is the actual sentence. This is just kind of thrown in there. You can hear the pause. So we put commas in between. You also use commas before and after an appositive. So what's an appositive? An appositive is a type of parenthetical clause that directly renames the noun it describes. It directly renames the noun it describes. So it's a type of parenthetical clause. You don't need it. You don't need it in there for the sentence to make sense. Right? So that's what a parenthetical clause is. But this is a special type of clause that directly renames the noun it describes. So again, modifiers, they modify something specific. So in this case, it's a modifier that is not really necessary, and it's a modifier that renames a noun. So for example, right here, Dr. No, a well-respected scientist, made an important discovery. So this is our parenthetical clause. It's just kind of thrown in there, right? But this is specifically an appositive because it's renaming Dr. No. So here's our noun. It's renaming. It's directly renaming. So who's Dr. No? He's a well-respected scientist. So basically another name for Dr. No is a well-respected scientist. It's just a way to describe him, right? It's describing a noun. And you could write it this way too. A well-respected scientist, Dr. No made an important discovery. It's directly renaming Dr. No. It is kind of thrown in there. You don't need it. Right? It's kind of just thrown in there. You don't really need it all that much, but it's just there, right? And again, here it's in between the sentence, so you put commas in between it. Here it's before the sentence, so you only put a comma, you only put one comma. If you put a comma here, that would make no sense, because since this is the beginning of the sentence, there should be a period here before for the end of the previous sentence, right? So it would make no sense if you put a comma up here. So here you would just put this comma, but in the case that it's in between a sentence, like in this case, you put commas in between it. So some other examples of a positive. Ned Stark, an honorable man, died as a result of his stupidity. An honorable man, again, just kind of randomly thrown in there. You don't really need it for the sentence to make sense. It's renaming Ned Stark. It's describing him, right? So who's Ned Stark? He's an honorable man. Another name for an honorable man could be Ned Stark, right? So it's like a definition, right? It's like defining Ned Stark. It's just another name for him. Another name for Ned Stark is an honorable man. And if you can't tell, I love Game of Thrones, so Ned Stark is the character from there. And you can write it again. You can write it, put in the beginning. An honorable man, Ned Stark died as a result of his stupidity. You could put it before the noun. Here it's after the noun, and here it's before the noun. You could do either, as long as it's near that noun, right? You can't put it all the way somewhere else, because then it won't make sense. Because you're renaming this, right? You're not renaming anything else, so it has to be either after or before. But either way, you put a comma. Pancake, my future corgi, will be my fluffy best friend. So you can hear that this is kind of just thrown in there. You can hear the pause when you read. So this is going to be a parenthetical clause, but it's specifically in a positive because it renames Pancake. So Pancake, who's Pancake? You could think that it's an actual pancake, but no. Pancake is my future corgi. So it's just another name for him. Again, you can write it this way. My future corgi, Pancake, will be my fluffy best friend. So again, it's renaming, it's defining a noun, it's defining Pancake in this case. Pasta, my favorite food, is the main reason for my desire to visit Italy. So my favorite food is a positive, it's after. You could also put it before. You could say my favorite food, pasta, is the main reason for my desire to visit Italy. Again, you can either put it before, you can put it after. If it's after, you put commas in between it. If it's before and it's the beginning of the sentence, then you put only one comma, You only put one comma after it. You also use commas to separate coordinate adjectives. So what are coordinate adjectives? Coordinate adjectives are basically just adjectives that they're an adjective, they're just describing a noun. But they're gonna be in sequence. They're gonna be together without an and to separate them. So for example, we looked at the long, sweaty line and decided to turn back. So long and sweaty. Long is an adjective, sweaty is an adjective. And because they're together and they're in sequence, like they're after each other, you put a comma. You could also say they're the long and sweaty. You could put the long and sweaty line, and in that case, you wouldn't use a comma. But because there's no and, you have to use a comma. I hope that made sense. So it's because you could put an and in here, and then you wouldn't use a comma. But because there's no and, you have to use a comma. Because it's two adjectives, and they're being used in sequence. Like they're being used after the other. The tasty, expensive food came from the restaurant on the corner. Tasty is an adjective, expensive is an adjective. They're describing food. And because there's no and in here, it's just tasty and then expensive, we put a comma. My cousin received a dedicated signed copy of her favorite book. Dedicated, adjective, signed, adjective, they're both describing copy. And because of that, we put comma because there's no and in between. If there was an and, you would not put a comma. Because there's an and they're being used in sequence, they're being used one right after the other, you put a comma. You also use commas in dates, addresses, place names, numbers, and quotations. So in dates, you would write it like this. Ursula is leaving for Jamaica on January 7th, 2004. So it's month, date, year. The Library of Congress is located at 101 Independence Avenue, Washington, D.C. So it's address, like the street number, city, state. In this case, since it's Washington, D.C., then it's this is like the city. If you wanted to finish this, it would be Imagine, this makes it weird. Like, you're never going to get that, I promise. Ignore that part. Like, let's say it's this, the city's called Washington, and let's say the city Washington is in Oregon. So it would be 101 Independence Avenue, comma, Washington, comma, Oregon, and then zip code. No comma. Right? So it's address, city, state, zip code. Address, comma, city, comma, state, zip code. Hopefully that made sense. The fact that there's this C right there makes it a little weird, because then you have to put a comma, but then there's a period already, so that's like double punctuation. So it makes it weird, but don't worry about it. Like, don't worry, you're never gonna get that. You won't get that, I promise. But hopefully that made sense for the address part. Then place names, annual tuition. Oh, I don't have an example for place names. Damn. Oh well. Well, it's just basically like city, right? So like you would do like San Jacinto, comma, California, right? Or you would do like New York, comma, New York City, comma, New York, right? So that's how you do the place names. And then numbers, you would use it for the thousands. So like this number right here, 42,000, comma, 500. So once you get to the thousands is when you start using commas. If you have 100, no. If you have 10, you don't use commas. But once you have 1,000, you're technically supposed to use a comma to separate them. If you have like 500,000, what if you have 1,000,000? Then you would do like this. Every 3 zeros, you put a comma. Or every 3 place spaces. Every 3 digit spaces. And then for quotations. So for quotations, you put a comma before the quotation. A lot of people do this. They put it after. No, it's before. You can see the quote right here. You can see the comma right here. It's before the quote, right? So in this case, you started the sentence with a quote, my sister is a nurse, and then you're going to go back to outside of the quote, like what's outside of what somebody's saying. So then you put comma, you end the quote, and then you continue the sentence. Okay, I hope that made sense. Will there be some other examples with quotes later, but okay. You also use commas to separate elements in a series, including the comma before and or. Including the comma before and or. So you use commas to separate elements in a series. So elements in a series. So it's just basically when you have a list, right? So that's basically what it means. When you have a list, you use commas to separate the elements in that list. So Game of Thrones is addicting, unique, and amazing. So Game of Thrones is 3 things, right? So it's a list of 3 things that Game of Thrones is. And because they're being used together, you're putting commas in between them, and you put the comma before the and. There's debate about whether you use a comma before and or whether you don't, but the SAT says that you have to, so do it, even if you don't agree. So addicting, comma, unique, comma, and amazing. In this case, this is actually an example of coordinate adjectives as well. It just happens to be that the items in this list are adjectives, right? And again, following that rule as well, you use commas. I want a Nutella milkshake, chocolate mousse, or chocolate covered strawberries right now. So this is a list of things I want. So it's a list of 3 things: Nutella milkshake, chocolate mousse, chocolate covered strawberries. It's a list. Right? Because it's a list, we're putting commas in between it. Here's the or, you put the comma before the or as well. The best dessert I have made, The best desserts I have made are a peach gelatin dessert, an amazing decadent chocolate mousse, a giant chocolate cake with dulce de leche in the middle, Nutella croissants, and a Nutella milkshake. So in this case, it's a list of desserts I have made: peach gelatin dessert, chocolate mousse, chocolate cake, Nutella croissants, and Nutella milkshake. And those are the items on the list, right? So we're going to put commas in between them. And you can see that we have the and right here. We put a comma before the and as well. Hopefully that made sense. Use commas to set off quoted text, except if you introduce a quotation with that. Use commas to set off quoted text, so use commas for quotations, except if you use a quotation starting with that. So here are some examples. We see right here, we started the sentence with a quote. So we start with the quote. Wait, and then we're ending the quote. So because we're ending the quote, we put a comma, then the quote. So, wait, Alicia said, period. Again, starting the sentence with the quote. Please bring me a napkin. End quote. So, comma, end quote. She said imperviously. And then we're not done with the sentence. If this was the end of the sentence, you would put a period. Right? But it's not the end of the sentence. We're inserting another quote. So, in that case, we put comma, continue the quote. Why do we do that? Well, because in these two cases, this is the beginning of the sentence, right? So here, the sentence goes after the quote, so we need to put a comma after. But in this case, the quote is coming after the sentence, so we put the comma first, then the quote. Okay, and then you end with the period. Also, again, the period goes before the quotation. Anything at the end of a sentence, at the end of a quote, if there's any punctuation at the end of a quote, you put it inside the quotation marks. And then here's another example. This is showing how the exception, like you don't use the comma if you introduce a quotation with that. So the article I read last night reported that the youth are rising up in protest. And I mean, I think that made sense. I don't feel like I have to explain it. But yeah, since you're using the word that, you don't have to put quotations.